First icon pack, we skipped the first hero. But this one, a max 88, looked a little bit too tasty to ignore. There are some big boy possibilities. Oh God, I had the wrong screen on. You can still see the screen. I know it's a striker. 67 physical. I think that's good because all the worst strikers have good physical, don't they? I'm sure they do. All the bad ones are the physical ones, or at least the low rated ones. 45 defending, but they're good in the, oh, that good heading accuracy makes me worried. 86 dribbling, the agility's all right. The rest ain't that good. 7, oh nah, it's an L in it, chat. Icon striker with 85 shooting, get the fuck out of here. 89, it's like Ian Wright, isn't it? Oh.